This episode of Shadowversity is brought to you by the Swords shirt, which proclaims the truth that every sword enthusiast knows down to their core, that swords are awesome. Why? Because swords! That's why. Available through Teespring, link in the description.
Shadowversity.
Greetings, I'm Shad, and the title of this video, How Deadly Are Swords in Real Life, is a tricky question. More complex than perhaps many people suppose, because it depends, okay? So for the sake of that, that's why I'm making this video, try and explain some of the circumstances in which swords are more effective and less effective, also depending on use. Because swords can't be thrown into just one bag, where swords are always this effective in cutting, or say even if you try and divide it by type. The katana is always this effective at cutting, compared to the longsword, and the falchion is this effective at cutting, and the rapier is always this effective at thrusting, because it doesn't take into account something very, very significant that is important for all swords, no matter the type, and that is how sharp they are. Okay, and also how pointy the pointy end is. When I say pointy, how acute it is. But that can go into sword type, but even if that point has been rolled or rounded or dinted a little bit, that can affect its lethality and its thrusting potential quite significantly. Now you might think, well, the answer is simple. You'll want to keep the swords as sharp as humanly possible in all circumstances. But that's kind of impossible, okay? Like if you think about, let's say, a career soldier and stuff like that, to what level is he conducting sword maintenance? Is it a daily ritual? Does he do it once a week? Does he do it once a month? Or does he let his sword fall into a little bit of neglect?
And even if the swordsman, whenever he sharpened the sword, got it as sharp as he could, it would only remain that sharp after the first few uses or strikes. And if those strikes run along mail or even gambeson, stuff like that, the edge will be that little bit more dull than it was before. It will still be very, very sharp, but not as sharp as it was. Heavens, just running the edge along the top of the sheath when you're pulling it out and putting it back in will also work to dull the blade. This is why both swords and knives need to continually be sharpened to maintain that level.
And the other question is, it's not always the perfect thing to keep a sword as sharp as humanly possible. What if they only want to keep it sharp enough? And this brings up another important point in regards to swords. To what purpose are they being used? Do you know the material that you're most often or likely going to be using this sword against? So there are all those things to try and consider when answering this question. And I want to talk a little bit now on the different levels of effectiveness that sharpness of swords can achieve. And where I get my points of reference and information from this is from sword tests. And I think one of the best ones done that emphasize the difference here is a recent video that Skallagrim has made in which he has been testing swords against padded armor. And he said that these swords that he was using were really sharp, okay? And he shows us cutting paper and all those things, so yes, evidently these swords are really sharp. But then he got one of his swords or two sharpened by someone who can really do a good job, and so this, crazy sharp as a sword can get, kind of sharp. And the difference in his test results was astounding, okay? Where previously these sharp swords were not able to cut through textile armor, showing how effective textile armor could be. And then he got a sword as sharp as possibly he could get it. Look, I'm hyperbole, right? But crazy sharp, okay? And then he demolished the armor. It was amazing. And this is important because it defines a significant difference between really sharp and insanely sharp. What also needs to be remembered in this circumstances is that to get a sword that sharp, usually the angle of the edge needs to be really, really acute, okay? And when that edge is sharpened up as much as possible, it becomes quite fragile and very susceptible to dints and chips. Therefore, if you're a soldier, you go into combat and there's a high likelihood that the edge of your sword is going to be coming into contact with some, pretty solid stuff, metal. It isn't always the best idea to pick a sword that has a really, really fine acute edge angle, or sharpening up to as sharp as it possibly can be, but still keeping it deadly sharp. And then in contrast to this, if you're going up against opponents who are wearing the softer ranges of armor, like gambeson, and you wanted the best chances of slicing through that to actually do serious damage, well, in those circumstances, you would want to pick a sword that has a really, really fine, thin edge and sharpen it up as much as humanly possible to chop through it. And there is a sword that was actually made to emphasize all those qualities to get through gambeson, which is a textile armor, more so than other swords. And that is the falchion. Now, there's a lot of different types of falchions. The one that emphasizes it most amongst all falchion is the Type 1 falchions, according to the Elmsley typology. And if you wanted to have a look at the real historical references to this types of falchions, have a look at the Cluny falchion or the Conyers falchion. These blade edges are incredibly thin, far thinner than most people have ever realized. I've done a whole video series on the truth about the falchion messer. I think it's a good watch if you wanted the information on it. But, like, you know, 1 to 2 mil thick, some like on the edges, really, really thin. And the running theory, the theory that I think is most accurate amongst other theories, that's the purpose of these swords, that these swords were engineered specifically to combat linen and textile armors. Of course, they can be used in other circumstances as well. They're deadly swords, all right? Like, if they're that good at cutting into, you know, materials that are meant to protect people, armor, so gambesons and stuff, imagine how effective they are at cutting into flesh as well. Gosh, all right, this is the type of weapon that is really useful against peasants who aren't armored very much. But coming up against metal armor, suddenly this type of falchion is not the type of sword you would want to pick in that circumstance.
And in contrast to this, say there was a swordsman, soldier or knight who had a sword with an edge that was a bit more robust, not fine, thin and acute, and therefore was unable to reach the same levels of sharpness as other swords. And what if he didn't keep the sword as sharp as he possibly could get it, but say wanted to keep the sword as sharp as a chisel instead of a razor? Still perfectly adequate and deadly to kill a person and to cut into flesh, sever arteries and even chop off limbs, but its effectiveness against gambeson would be drastically different to, say, a type of falchion or any sword with a fine acute edge that was really insanely sharp. But their sword would be safer to be employed in half-swording techniques, and it would also be more effective in the thrust if it had an acute point, and if it had a high ridge, which would make the sword more rigid and sturdy, which certainly makes it perform better in the thrust, but having a high ridge often creates a wider edge angle as well, which affects the sharpness of the sides.
This is what I meant when I said it depends, or indeed, we could use a wonderful word that we know someone really loves, context. It all depends on context. The next side to this is that it's a very complex and a misunderstood thing about the damaging and lethality, lethal ability of cuts are to the human body. Now, in the medieval period, it's a different story to the modern period because it didn't take a significant level of a cut to potentially be deadly thanks to infection and the level of medical technology that existed in the time period. Now, generally, cuts are considered to have more stopping power, but that's only if it's a devastating, really effective cut. And this is why it's also really important, if you ever learn historical swordsmanship and stuff like that, there's a great emphasis on a thing called edge alignment. Because if the angle of the blade is off to the motion of the blade, that means the sword, all right, the blade will actually bounce off the target and really affect the, damage potential of the cut. Because to incapacitate someone, to actually get the full benefit, the stopping power that cuts can get, you need to make a good cut. So it needs to have appropriate force, right angle to really do it. Because small cuts and things like that, though yes, people might die from infection later on, you'd be surprised how often people can just, push through the pain and stuff. Adrenaline does amazing things and keep fighting. One of, it's not a nice point of, reference and information for this, is having had a look at machete fights, which are very violent. I don't entirely recommend it, but I have looked into it just for my own academic research. And in fact, Thomas from Medieval Review pointed out a lecture that he attended by a HEMA practitioner who had also studied machete fights. And when you look at these videos, it's disturbing. Like, these are violent. I don't recommend you watching them per se. But what's very interesting to note is how long a person is able to live, right, after having received what you would think are really devastating cuts, and a lot of them. You see, to kill someone outright with a single cut, okay, it's more difficult than you might think. You have to either decapitate them or hit them somewhere vitally, in the head, or lop them in half, which is even more exceptional. Though you can find archaeological evidence of some really crazy, chopping in half kind of action. Obviously, that's far more exceptional than the norm because you have a rib cage protecting your vital organs. That's the purpose of the rib cage. So, unless you get like in between those ribs, a cut to the body isn't going to sink too deep. Cut to the stomach might, but unless, it's so devastating, and this is kind of getting very kind of graphic. There you go, this video will probably be demonetized, but unless the cut is so devastating that their guts are falling out, okay, a person can actually still maintain combative ability far more than people realize, even having a cut across the gut. And arms and other things. So the next kind of deadly cut is when you are able to sever an artery, but that doesn't mean your opponent is incapacitated, okay? Especially, even arteries, they can still fight at a lethal level against you, even having an artery severed for a couple of seconds, maybe a minute or so. It all depends, but again, adrenaline is an amazing thing. So this is why there's a bit of a debate in the historical swordsmanship community, HEMA community, about whether or not duels, when they're conducting tournaments or sparring sessions, stuff like that, that the opponent should stop when one of the opponents lands a hit on the other opponent. Because in real life, okay, depending, like if they're not decapitated, if they're not killed instantly, they would still be able to continue to fight to a very dangerous level. And in some instances, say they get a cut on the arm, all right, and if they push through the cut, they could still kill the opponent, especially if the opponent's sword is actually out of action or not in a defensible position. Like if it's a cut and they just, well, I'm cut, screw it, I'll grab it, and slash hit cut. In return, okay, the opponent that was technically hit first can still win the fight and survive. So trying to recreate true, authentic historical swordsmanship can be a very difficult thing because it's hard to account for the true lethality of swords. So you can recreate it up to the first hit landing, but then trying to determine how effective that cut would have been, how debilitated you would be from the cut, and how, what ability you retain to be able to fight from that, it's kind of impossible to know in a simulation. But because sparring sessions and tournaments and other things like that, and even especially in movies, all right, I just did a review on the fight scenes from Narnia Prince Caspian. And the slightest touch from a sword will kill henchmen, unless they're a main character. But the slightest touch from a sword, and it seems to have created a perception in general public that swords are lethal if you just get, one hit on your opponent, when no, not really. Cuts, not necessarily. Do you see how sophisticated and complex this kind of discussion is about the true lethality of swords? Now, they are deadly, all right? Thousands, millions of people have died from swords throughout history. But in terms of how they died and how quickly, it's a far more complex subject. Because the other portion of how effective these swords are is the thing that we were talking about before, how sharp the sword is as well, all right? And the edge angle, because they can land a hit on their opponent and only do a superficial, cut in the skin that doesn't penetrate deep into the muscle or even reach the bone if, sharpness and the angle was off. And so for cuts like that, a swordsman can actually receive a surprising number of them and keep fighting without any real issue. And then there are cuts that don't look debilitating, okay, that seem to be superficial, that can really incapacitate someone's ability to fight. Like, say, a cut across the back of the wrist that severs tendons and suddenly you lose your ability to grip your sword. Their ability to fight effectively from there on forward is suddenly really difficult. Say, a slight slash above, your eyebrow, okay? Perfectly survivable and stuff like that, but if you ever had a cut on your head, which I have, just to let you know, the amount of blood that just flows from, because, your body sends a lot of blood to your head, right? It's surprising. Like, it was a rock. Rock hit me on the side of the head, and I was playing a dumb game with friends. I won't go into details. And so it looked like some kind of shot out of World War II where half the side of my head was just covered in blood. And I didn't feel any pain or anything like that. I wasn't even lightheaded. And it was actually a small little, cut on the head. But my goodness, The amount of blood that came from the thing, it was amazing. And I still had no detrimental things. I was nowhere near dangerous levels of blood loss or anything like that. But so a cut above the eye, all that blood flowing through your eye, and suddenly your vision is now impeded massively. And therefore, again, your ability to fight is greatly affected. So it also depends on where you're actually striking your opponent, which determines the amount of force you would want to put behind the strike to reach incapacitating levels against an opponent. Now, what's interesting about this is that we've been talking all about cuts so far. And of course, the other component to this is thrusts. Now, the danger about thrusts is that they are far easier to get into vital organs than it is for cuts. Just aim for the largest part, or the part of the body that humans have, the torso, to hit that area and then penetrate deep enough to hit a vital organ. It can be job done. It might not incapacitate them. In fact, again, it can be surprising how long a person can fight, even with a lethal stab to a vital organ. But if it's a stab that reaches the heart, well, that can be game over right there. But a person is far more likely to die from a thrust or a stab in a vital organ after a fight than they are to die from a cut that hits on their arm or their side, even their gut if it doesn't penetrate the stomach and stuff like that. And this is why generally thrusts or stabs are considered more lethal than cuts. But that doesn't mean instantly lethal. Hollywood loves to do the thing that people die instantly from one hit. Well, no, it takes time for people to die unless heads are being lopped off. And other certain exceptional kind of strikes. So we're looking at arteries, things that hit the heart and other things like that.
Now, with all these things considered, I hope you can understand that the question of how easy is it to kill someone with a sword is complex and also very much depends on a lot of factors. The type of attack you're doing, whether it's a cut or a thrust, the sharpness of the edge or how acutely pointed the tip is, how much mass is in the sword or how rigid the sword is, do you have to get through armor, how much strength are you putting behind the sword strike, how much mass is in the blade, and of course, is the strike executed properly in regards to edge alignment. So there, of course, can be many situations if you know how to use the sword and you know how to throw a proper strike with correct edge alignment, appropriate force and speed behind the cut with the edge being sharp enough. In those circumstances, most, solid strikes to the head will kill someone instantly. It will easily bite in and through the skull, and if the sword is like mega incredibly sharp as it can be, cut right through their head and decapitation, not a problem. But if one of those parameters is missing, edge alignment, the mass of the sword, enough strength, that can very much determine the difference between a lethal hit and a superficial cut. And then the same type of strike that landed on someone's head will do a very different level of damage and incapacitate the person to a much different degree if that strike hit a different part of the body. And the things that I'm talking about here also applies to thrusts as well.
So ultimately, yes, swords are of course deadly, and they can be very deadly depending on the type of attack or strike and the qualities of the sword. And they can also be far more survivable than you might realize, except for the infection thing. Okay, a small cut infection, die anyway. But in the modern day, it's amazing how many cuts you could receive because you can deal with the infection side of things and still live. All very fun things to consider, and hopefully it's given you food for thought. So thank you for watching, and until next time.